God says, "My child, you've been through enough battles, but hear me clearly. Today your victory begins." God says, "My beloved, the pain you felt was never to destroy you. It was to strengthen you for the blessing I am about to release." God says, "Every sleepless night you cried, I counted your tears. Today I will give you peace that no storm can shake." God says, "The battle you thought would end you is the one that will crown you with victory." God says, "You're not behind. You're right where I need you to be for my purpose to unfold." God says, "What others called impossible, I have already written as done." God says, "When you were fighting alone, I was fighting beside you. That's why you're still standing." God says, "I saw your pain when no one else did, and now I will reward your faithfulness in front of many." God says, "Your waiting season wasn't wasted. It was preparation for something far greater than you imagined." God says, "I closed certain doors not to punish you, but to protect you from what was never meant for you." God says, "What you lost was temporary. What I'm giving you next will last forever."
God says, "Do not be afraid of the unknown. I have already gone before you and made the crooked path straight." God says, "The people who walked away were never meant to carry your blessing. Their exit was your protection." God says, "When you feel weak, remember, my strength is made perfect in your weakness." God says, "You are not forgotten. I've been working silently to bring everything together for your good." God says, "That closed chapter wasn't rejection. It was my redirection toward your destiny." God says, "I'm turning the same situation that broke you into the testimony that will inspire others." God says, "Your tears have watered the ground of your miracle. Now it's time to see the harvest." God says, "Don't chase what left. What's coming is designed exactly for who you're becoming." God says, "The weapons formed against you may appear strong, but they will not prosper." God says, "I know you're tired, but victory is closer than you think. Hold on a little longer." God says, "I'm aligning everything, time, people, and opportunities to fulfill my promise over your life." God says, "You may have walked through fire, but you didn't burn because my hand was upon you." God says, "I am restoring your joy, your peace, and your confidence, piece by piece, day by day." God says, "The pain you feel today will soon be replaced with gratitude for what I taught you through it." God says, "Don't look back. What's ahead of you is far greater than what you left behind." God says, "You thought it was over, but this is where your real story begins." God says, "You didn't fail. You learned how strong faith truly is." God says, "The delay you're facing is not denial. It's divine timing." God says, "I've seen your faith when it was hardest to believe. That's why your reward will be greater." God says, "You're stepping into a season where everything lost will return multiplied." God says, "Don't fight for attention. I'm preparing people who will see your worth instantly." God says, "What was broken will not only be fixed, it will be made brand new." God says, "The doors that were once locked will open in your favor. No force can stop it." God says, "Stop fearing what could go wrong and start trusting me with what will go right." God says, "Even when you don't see progress, know that my plan is still moving perfectly." God says, "I'm replacing your confusion with clarity and your chaos with calm." God says, "Don't compare your path with others. Your journey is sacred and uniquely mine." God says, "What once made you cry will soon make you praise." God says, "The miracle you're waiting for is already on its way. Just keep believing." God says, "The same hands that held you in pain will lift you in power." God says, "Be still and know that I am fighting for you even when you can't see it." God says, "You've been through enough to know that I never fail. Trust me again." God says, "I'm sending peace into your heart and purpose into your steps." God says, "What you survived proves that grace is real and victory is certain." God says, "I'm turning every no you received into a better yes designed for your destiny." God says, "The breakthrough you prayed for is being released in ways you won't expect." God says, "You didn't come this far to give up now. You're almost at the promise." God says, "I am restoring everything the enemy tried to destroy in your life." God says, "You were chosen for this battle because I knew you would win it." God says, "Every disappointment was a setup for divine appointment." God says, "My love for you never depended on your perfection. It's unconditional and eternal." God says, Your story will prove that faith always wins. God says, don't doubt my timing. When it happens, it will happen suddenly. God says, I'm removing fake people from your life to make room for faithful ones. God says, I will make your name known in places where your feet haven't yet walked. God says, this is your confirmation. You're stepping into answered prayers. God says, you didn't lose the battle, you won the lesson. Now comes the blessing. God says, every wait was worth it. You'll soon understand why. God says, my grace carried you through the valley. My glory will lift you to the mountain. God says, beloved, today is not an ordinary day. It's the day your victory begins. God says, you thought it was over, but I've only just begun your story of glory. God says, the same place where you were broken will become the stage of your breakthrough. God says, what was meant to harm you, I have turned into a blessing with your name on it. God says, I'm about to surprise you with what you stopped expecting. God says, you didn't lose. I removed what couldn't go where I'm taking you. God says, don't cry over what's gone. Something far better is already on its way. God says, when you had nothing left, your faith kept you alive. Now it's time to rise. God says, you may not understand now, but soon everything will make sense. God says, I'm restoring your peace, your purpose, and your power, all at once. God says, what you prayed for in private will be celebrated in public. God says, the enemy tried to silence you, but I made your voice louder. God says, I'm not just healing your heart, I'm renewing your whole life. God says, you're not waiting on me. I'm waiting on your faith to believe again. God says, your faith moved mountains you didn't even see. God says, every closed door was me protecting you from a lesser destiny. God says, I'm making a way in the wilderness, and you'll call it a miracle. God says, the same fire that scared you will shape you into strength. God says, you will soon thank me for what didn't work out. God says, I've already written your victory. Stop worrying about the process. God says, you are stepping into the answers you've been praying for. God says, you may feel forgotten, but heaven never lost sight of you. God says, the pain was necessary. It built the strength your blessing requires. God says, I'm sending unexpected help that will lift your burden in a moment. God says, every delay was divine protection. Trust my timing. God says, I know what you need before you even ask. God says, you've carried others for so long. Now let me carry you. God says, my plan for you hasn't changed, even when you made mistakes. God says, I'm removing confusion and replacing it with direction. God says, don't let fear speak louder than faith. God says, your season of waiting ends with overflowing blessings. God says, I'm about to send a blessing that will make you forget the pain. God says, you survived what others couldn't because I needed your story to inspire. God says, I'm turning your weakness into wisdom and your wounds into weapons.
Someone needed to hear this today. If that's you, comment victory below and I'll release the next message soon.